Hello, I'm Dylan Bond of the Southwest Initiative for the Study of Middle East Conflicts, and welcome to SISMEC Presents, a discussion on the most current issues of conflict throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Today we are joined by Dr. John Entelis. Dr. Entelis is a professor of political science and the director of the Middle East Studies program at Fordham University. Specifically, he focuses on political parties, institutions, and transformation across North Africa. Dr. Entelis is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of North African Studies and the publications officer of the American Institute of Maghreb Studies, AIMS. Most recently, he gave a talk at the University of Arizona entitled North Africa's Intifadas and Democratic Transitions, Promises and Pitfalls, which is also streaming on SISMEC's website. Dr. Entelis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay. So to start, because of your areas of expertise spreading across North Africa, I would like to use the interview to move around the region with each question I ask. So first on Tunisia. Since ex-President Ben Ali was booted out of office on January 14th in what has been called the Jasmine Revolution, has also been called the spark for popular mobilization across the region, we haven't heard much from Tunisia. With the momentum of the uprisings in Egypt quickly after that, international and regional media has quickly shifted to Tahrir Square in Cairo. Could you provide a brief overview of what has happened in Tunisia since the fall of Ben Ali?
Well, understandably, because the country had been under dictatorship for so long and had been more or less stable politically and otherwise, this revolution took the Tunisians by surprise. And though I'm very optimistic about how eventually it will develop, it's been this kind of learning experience. The fortunate thing is that they are taking their time, it seems to me, to try to get the institutions in place that would generally represent the democratic aspirations that the people fought for. So that there's going to be a constituent assembly that will be gathered in July, whose purpose is to write a new constitution and to write up new electoral laws and to prepare for parliamentary and presidential elections in the period after that. So to the extent that while there was a period of instability and uncertainty, as people were not happy with the interim government that was in place when Ben Ali stepped down, because many of the people in the cabinet were former members of the ruling party that was associated with, obviously, Ben Ali. So there have been a number of turnovers within the cabinet. The prime minister had to resign, the prime minister had to come in. Other members of the RCD that were in the cabinet withdrew, to the point now where we have essentially a new cabinet that is not made up of former members of the RCD. So it has a certain amount of legitimacy. But of course, now there are many groups who have complaints, political complaints, but many economic complaints that they want satisfied, and they want it satisfied immediately because of the period of time that a lot of these demands have been postponed. Additionally, a lot of the police and security services have crumbled, withered away, disappeared, and so you've had a rise in both the cities and in the countryside of thefts and of robberies and other kinds of criminal activities that hopefully will, as the police now get back into the scene, will be, if not eliminated, at least reduced.
Okay, excellent. Just to build off that, you mentioned constitutional reforms, and I was wondering if with that constitutional reform, are we seeing a complete break with the past in terms of, say, election years or election policies, or is where's the middle ground between that, perhaps?
Well, people have asked that question. Is this just a regime change, or is this a fundamental transformation of the Tunisian political system? And that's a fair enough question. You can't transform a political system overnight. So clearly it's regime change. Hopefully, to the extent that these constitutional and other new institutions get put into place that do represent democratic aspirations, that the popular attitude, if not the overall political culture of Tunisia, will be commensurate with these institutions. That would then be the basis of what I would then define as a fundamental transformation of the political system.
Okay. Excellent. Well, now on to Egypt, the next question I had. In your talk on democratic transformation throughout North Africa, you mentioned that there are a lot of good thinkers, intellectuals, and those who could envision and institute political reform on the ground in Egypt. However, you also argue that the problem in Egypt that is hindering their direct involvement in this political transformation is the army. Now, first, do you think that the army has the ability to ensure a democratic transition in Egypt?
That's a $64,000 question because ever since the coup of July 1952 that brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power, and then with his death and Sadat's coming to power, also a military man, it was Sadat who was part with Nasser, the Revolutionary Command Council, the three officers that staged the coup, and Mubarak himself. These were all three were military men. The military has been one of the main pillars of the Egyptian state for a good half a century. And they've acquired incredible amount of interests, economic and other kinds of interests, patronage, that will make it very hard for them to withdraw completely. There's just too many interests, too many people involved. The army is absolutely huge, way out of proportion to its security needs. So I think it's going to be very difficult. And I don't see any military figures of the stature of the kind that I mentioned in my speech yesterday regarding the quality of Egyptian leadership that would be necessary to take the country forward. So this to me is what I consider the main stumbling block for the consolidation of Egyptian democracy. I am still convinced about the quality of Egyptian leadership that's out there, that has historically shown itself to be out there. Whether or not they will be able to effect a fundamental change as it relates to the military, that's the big question. Especially, and I also mentioned this yesterday, as long as the issue of the peace treaty with Israel is important, the U.S. support for that peace treaty, the U.S. support for Egypt in terms of fighting against terrorism, which means that you keep the military supplied, all of which sustains the military's ability to maintain themselves with the necessary instruments of coercion, unfortunately. So if you take the economic interest, the long-term involvement of the military within politics, you take the relationship with the U.S. and the more global concern about the Egypt and Israel peace treaty, it's going to be quite hard for them to withdraw completely. Now, are they capable of pulling back sufficiently to allow the democratic aspirations of the Egyptian peoples to make themselves heard? That's going to be the key things. I mean, I think it'd be unrealistic to think they're just going to disappear from the political scene overnight. But does that mean it's going to be a police state or a state run by the military? It doesn't have to be. But I think we're in this sort of transitional moment where it's not yet clear how it's going to go one way or the other.
Okay. Just a way to build off of this. I mean, the Army's involvement in perhaps this transition is the stumbling block, as you just mentioned. I mean, are there certain ways that you can think of, in theory, in terms of envisioning, these ways that can get these types of people that you're talking about more involved in the process? I mean, for example, we've seen, in terms of constitutional reforms, we've seen Ammar Hamzawi, Ammar Musa, these people involved in these issues. The same thing. Just in terms of how, ways that perhaps you can envision to ensure that these people stay relevant in the political scene.
Well, I mean, the essence of democratic politics is the rule of law. And the rule of law is predicated on constitutions and legislative decrees that reflect the popular will. It's only through those mechanisms, through the constitutional and institutional mechanisms that will be put in place and that be truly representative of the Egyptian people, could those kinds of individuals then assume significant political positions. Now, with the military in the position that it is, how committed is it to true constitutional reform? I mean, the amendments that were recently passed in this referendum, some people questioned about the fact that religious parties, quote unquote, are not allowed to be organized. The fact that Sharia law is still the law of the land, supposedly, and so on. So people got concerned about the way in which the military is fine-tuning these constitutional provisions in ways that people don't think are fully democratic. The institutions matter because the alternatives to institutions would be back to the role of individuals. And it was the overemphasis on individuals, Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak, that was cause of the problem in all these countries. That whether charismatic or otherwise, legitimacy ends up being associated with a particular individual, and that individual ultimately ends up substituting for the state and substitutes for institutions. So clearly what has to happen is institutions have to replace individuals in the decision-making process writ large, and that's the only way democracy could be institutionalized. So again, it all comes together: the role of the military, institutions, the secular forces within social society, civil society, and other kind of forces who have, I think, legitimate democratic credentials. They would have to work through these institutions so that you don't have a replication of rule by individuals as opposed to by institutions.
And like you mentioned, I mean, this isn't something that's going to happen overnight.
No, it's not going to happen overnight. To the extent that one believes that a political culture, a democratic political culture, is important for democratic political institutions, and I think they are. I think if you look back in modern Egyptian history, there's I think enough evidence to give you confidence that the Egyptian people, who in the past had a multi-party system, in the interwar period, as you know, between World War I and World War II, across a whole range of parties, and people participated, and there were elections, and yes, of course, a great percentage of the population is illiterate and poor, but for the most part, it did demonstrate that the politically conscious strata of Egyptian society, both historically and even contemporaneously, have the capacity to reflect the democratic political culture that would then allow the process of institution building, as you said, which is going to take a while to develop. So again, this is a point of view, and there'll be obviously a lot of other people who are much more critical and cynical about that possibility, especially if the Muslim Brotherhood ends up being an important actor. But to me, that's part and parcel of the democratic process.
Pluralism, absolutely. So only time will tell on that issue.